to our webinar today, Building Tribal Court Capacity. My name is Jessica Pierce, and I work for the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. I will be your host today. That means that I'm in charge of our Adobe Connect environment. So I just want to go over a few things with you to make sure you're familiar with the environment. This is a web and telephone-based meeting, and we do want it to be interactive. So what that means is if you're using your telephone handset to listen today and you'd like to make a comment or ask a question out loud, I'd like you to use the raised hand feature. You can see that there's kind of an indistinct icon of a person with their hand raised that's kind of right on the little menu bar above the PowerPoint slides. If you click on that person, that'll let you raise your hand and I can unmute your phone. If you're in listening mode, that's okay too. We'd like you to participate via chat, and I see that many of you are already using the chat to introduce yourselves. We appreciate that. We are going to be using poll questions today as well, so we'd like to make sure that everyone responds to the poll questions. It gives us a better idea of who's in the audience, and you'll get to see the answers that other people give as well. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please do type them into chat, and I will answer any technical questions you have, and our presenters will answer any presentation-related questions you may have. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rebekah, HorseChief from the National American Indian Court Judges Association, who is sponsoring today's webinar. Rebekah.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on Building Tribal Court Capacity. My name is Rebekah, HorseChief. I'm Osage from Oklahoma, and I am the Program Coordinator for the National American Indian Court Judges Association. I'll be moderating today. We want this to be an interactive experience, so please feel free to ask questions throughout and to make use of the chat feature. And with that, I'll introduce our faculty. Adrea Korthase is a member of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians and from Boyne City, Michigan. She works at NCJFCJ as a Senior Program Manager, providing training and technical assistance to state and tribal courts. Prior to NCJFCJ, she's worked for the State of Oregon DHS and for the City of Detroit. She's also a former Tribal Court Program Specialist at the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. She has a JD from Michigan State College of Law with a certificate in Indigenous Law and Policy. Angela Fasana is a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and currently serves as the court administrator for the Grand Ronde Tribal Court and has done so for the past 18 years. Angela received her bachelor's degree from Portland State University in 1994 and a JD from Northwestern School of Law at Lewis and Clark in 1997. And with that, I will hand it over to our faculty.
Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking this opportunity to be on the phone today to listen to us talk a little bit about building tribal court capacity. I also must say I take this opportunity to brag a little bit about some of the programs we've developed here in Grand Ronde, and I highly encourage questions. So please make sure you use the chat feature and or raise your hand. I'm going to start a little bit, you received my background, but I also wanted to say that prior to coming over here as the first court administrator, I worked in the tribal attorney's office representing parents and children in dependency actions. And when I came over to the tribal court as the court administrator in 2000, one of the first programs that was already getting underway was our indigent defense program. So I'm going to go right into discussing a little bit about how we built that program. So prior to my coming on, the chief judge was the administrator of the court. And what she had presented to tribal council was a pilot project for an indigent defense program. The mission of the program, as you can see on the slides, was to provide legal representation to all children and parents who come before the court in dependency action. Parents, the only qualification is parents have to fill out an affidavit of indigency and file a request for an attorney to be appointed for them for their particular case. The tribal council eventually codified the ability for parents to be appointed attorneys in our Children and Families Ordinance, which is available on our website for your review. Starting the program, we started this officially in 2001 with budgeted funds, but prior to that, the judge had solicited 5 attorneys who provided pro bono work to parents and children who were within the court. Because as you can imagine, I was on the attorney side of things, and must say that I wasn't a huge supporter of bringing more attorneys into the room and, you know, making the process seem longer. And what ended up happening, though, is as we developed this indigent defense program, we realized that just the opposite happened. And I was glad to be one of the ones that were wrong about starting this program. The benefits we've noticed from starting this, and we noticed them right away, was shorter court proceedings. Prior to having indigent defense program here at the court, we had several tribal members who had their children taken away who would go to Wednesday night council meetings, and they would want to talk to tribal council about their cases and the fact that they were wronged in some way and that their kids were taken away without any basis. What we ended up happening, though, is once we had attorneys on board, the council was able to deflect those questions and say the court, the tribe and the court are now providing you with an attorney. Those attorneys were then able to address those questions to the court, and the parents weren't taking up tons of court time asking all those questions and tons of council time at council meetings talking about those questions. So what went from 3-hour hearings, because parents needed some lengthy discussions and conversations about what was happening with their families, went to more like an hour and a half hearings. So that was an immediate benefit we saw right away. This also played out when we were talking about scheduling. So it was easier when we had attorneys that were representing the parents and children to schedule out court hearings so they were occurring within the time frame. The other benefit to that was, subsequent to that, was the budget. So our judges here in Grand Ronde were contracted. So if they're spending less hours on the bench and basically managing cases from the bench, their bills went down because they were spending less time doing that. So shorter court proceedings equated to a shorter budget for us in terms of the overall court budget. Also, the other benefit that I saw as a tribal member and felt was really important was there was a greater understanding of the child welfare process. So trying to explain to someone the process when they're in crisis, when they're in a courtroom, or when they're up in front of council at a council meeting is not the optimal opportunity to explain what the process is about, what the goals of the program are. So what I saw was attorneys being able to talk to parents when they were outside of the proceedings and a little bit removed from the emergency and the urgency of the situation, and talk to them about how the goal was to reunify and what the process was like, and that you'll have this hearing to talk about what happened, and then you'll have another opportunity, and so on and so forth. So to me, as a tribal member, I saw tribal members having a greater understanding of that child welfare process, and that can be infectious because it was infectious when it was bad, and everybody was feeling as though the child welfare process was something just put in place to remove their children. And I think that they started seeing that the child welfare process was now more of a reunification and a way to help them and their families. So those were some of the main benefits. We have had some challenges over the years. It is a budgetary issue. The program here in Grand Ronde is funded 100% by the tribal government dollars. So as you know, tribal budgets fluctuate, and so that's always a concern. Fortunately, our tribal council has continued to fund this program. It is somewhat of a minimal cost for us, but they've continued to fund that, and for that I'm grateful, but that's always a challenge when I'm talking to other tribal courts about starting a program such as this. Recruitment can be difficult. We are an hour from Salem and an hour and a half to 2 hours from Portland, which are the main areas where attorneys are in this area. So recruiting attorneys who are willing to drive out here, participate in lengthy hearings, is also a challenge and relates to the budget. You have to compensate them for a half a day's work in most cases to come out for a hearing. So that it poses a challenge for this program. Adrea, did you want to talk a little bit about that? I know as my program specialist, you worked on that recruitment and maybe wanted to touch on some of those challenges.
Yeah, so the recruitment seemed to be the best when we talked to the attorneys who were already serving as in the indigent defense program, and to use word of mouth to maybe either recruit people that they knew or that they knew were just coming out of law school. I know that there was at least one attorney when I was there who had just recently come out of law school. So, utilizing the Bar Association and different law schools, the publications that they had was really helpful.
Okay, thank you. She was my hands-on person for that, so I knew she'd have a better understanding of that than I. Another area that I struggle with a little bit is training. So I have the sense that if anybody comes to work for my tribal government and my tribal nation, that they have an understanding of who they're working for, which means they have to have some understanding of the Grand Ronde people and a little bit of where we came from. So again, having attorneys drive all the way out here to participate in a couple of hour training to where they're getting that information is another challenge. Luckily, webinars and distance learning has helped with that as well. But I think that's an important piece for people to understand, not only the people they're working for, but the system that's different. So our laws are different in the state of Oregon, and our processes are somewhat different. So there's an educational curve that has to take place, and that can be a challenge when starting up this type of a program. And then again, with all of these court programs, you're going to see there's a development of infrastructure. So when I first came on, and these are brand new programs, policies and procedures have to be developed. Contracts have to be drafted and reviewed. You have to develop a system for tracking invoices and paying those invoices and working with the accounting department to do so. So there's some development of infrastructure that can also be a bit challenging when you're first getting started. So our first poll question, I'm curious to know how many of you out there have a tribal court indigent defense program. So if you could answer the poll question. Okay, so seems like most don't. So I'm curious to find out for those who do have one. I think the next question then was, and I'm looking for it here, are they paid advocates or are they spokesperson? I think was that. I'm trying to find. Jessica's looking for the right question.
I am. I don't know where I put that question. Let me see. Here we go.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so the options were, for those of you who do have indigent defense programs, are they pro bono attorneys, lay spokespersons, others, or you're not sure?
And while you're answering the poll question, if anyone would like to raise your hand and participate in talking about some challenges you're facing or some successes that you've seen with your program, or maybe questions that you have about getting one started, feel free to use that raising hand feature that Jessica talked about on the top of your screen.
Okay. So it sounds like tribally funded. I'm seeing in the chat. Michigan Indian Legal Services, which reminds me, I see that in the chat is one of our indigent defense attorneys. Fabio's on the line, and Native American Program Oregon Legal Services has graciously been working with our indigent defense program for many years, and so I appreciate their work. And if you have anything that you want to chime in about any of the challenges of working remotely or any of the benefits, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. Okay, so for those of you who don't have programs, if you would like to put in the chat or raise your hand, what are some of the reasons what are some of the challenges you feel like are preventing you from being able to start the program? Have some people typing. I'm just curious as to what some of the obstacles are. Long pause. We're waiting for some responses here. Yeah. And again, Fabio's chiming in saying that the drawback for them is the remote representation. And I think that that's a hurdle for a lot of us. And for a lot of our reservations that are remote is not only them getting here for court hearings, but having that in-person client contact. We try to make efforts. We have tribal members in the Portland area, so if we have somebody that a case is with parents in the Portland area, we try to match them up with attorneys in the Portland area as best we can, but because of conflicts and just the small nature of the tribe, that's not always possible. So that is definitely a challenge you will see in starting one of these programs. And Kimberly says that they tend to shy away from adversarial proceedings and rely on peacemaking, which I think is another program we're going to talk about here a little bit in the future. So I can appreciate that. I myself would prefer peacemaking type processes. Okay, it looks like nobody else is typing, so if there's no other questions about the Indigent Defense Program specifically, I'm going to move into a series of programs that I developed over time that, for me, the focus was tribal member involvement in the court. So I wanted our community and my tribal membership to see the court as a resource, as a part of the community to help them, and not just as a place to go when they were either in trouble or in crisis with their families or in some type of dispute. So I also wanted the tribal membership to have a voice in what was happening in the court proceedings. And so I tended to try to develop some programs that would engage tribal members and community members to be involved in what was happening in the court, because traditionally for us, family matters, particularly such as child welfare, were handled more by the membership rather than by some adversarial process. So I wanted to develop some programs that would bring some of that back into this process. The first one that we developed here with that in mind was our Tribal Member Review Board. And in Oregon, we have what's called the Citizen Review Board. So this is a very similar model. in that, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't move the slide. Thank you. It's a very similar model where it is a board made up of approved tribal members. And when I say approved tribal members, I mean they've been, background checks have been done, they've been cleared and sent to tribal council for approval to serve on the tribal member review board. They periodically review cases of kids who are wards of the court. Some of those kids are in dependency proceedings, some of those are in guardianship proceedings. The board then makes findings and recommendations to the Children and Family Services Program as well as to the court. So how this looks functionally is the court assigns a case to the TMRB for review. It's a child welfare case. It could be a guardianship, for example. The Tribal Member Review Board then conducts a review, so they have access to the entire case file. They conduct the review. They talk to all the participants that are there, so the parties mostly, and then they develop some recommendations. They type those up with the assistance of the court program specialist, and those recommendations then are forwarded to the Children and Family Services Program as well as to the court and to the parents. And there's an opportunity for people to respond to those recommendations to the court, and then the court then issues an order either implementing the recommendations and saying that this is now an order of the court, or making some changes, implementing them in part, saying they agree with a couple of them, and so therefore making that part of the order, which will then go out. So that's how that whole process looks. In order to develop this program, though, we first had to get it codified. So we put a provision in our Children and Families Ordinance, which again is online at grandronde.org. And we put some provisions in there about who qualifies and so on, which we're going to talk about, and the process a little bit about what it would look like for cases that go before the Tribal Member Review Board. This board particularly is one where it's been historically in the past tribal elders who have applied to sit on this board, and they have provided some great insight into the process of the cases and been able to think out of the box about what kids need and what people in the family can contribute to meeting the needs of the kids. So it is definitely one of my favorite programs, if I had one, because I feel like it is definitely reaching that tribal, cultural, historical goal that I had in mind for getting tribal members involved in what's happening in the court. When we first started the program, of course, we had to get support from tribal council. So we had to go to council, and we had to explain to them what the program was that I wanted to start and how it would work. We also needed to get our Child Protective Team, which is our Children and Family Services Program, on board with it, because now they were going to be doing a different process. They wouldn't be coming to court hearings. They would more be coming to these more informal reviews where they're sitting around the table. So it changes the game for them, so we had to get them on board with it and explain everything to them. Then we had to get our tribal code revisions, so that sometimes takes a while to get all of that through legal and through tribal council. And then our biggest step was to recruit and train volunteers. So we had to advertise, and that had its own challenges because, as you can imagine, some of the tribal members were not jumping at the chance to get involved in everybody else's business, which is really what you're doing when you're listening to family members' issues and problems. And so some of our tribal members were a bit hesitant to get involved. And so we had a little bit of recruitment, and then we require 30 hours of training for our volunteers because I wanted them to be well trained on the process, on all of the aspects of what they were looking at so that they could give well-informed recommendations to the court. So a lot of that takes time, of course, to train and make sure you're dealing with their schedules because they are volunteering their time. So we had to be somewhat flexible in doing that. So that's how we started it. In looking at what it takes to be a tribal member review board member here for Grand Ronde, they have to be volunteers. So there's no pay associated with this. And I I was a firm believer in this because I think that there are a lot of committees within the tribe that had stipends and other forms of payment if you were involved in them. But I felt like if we were going to make this very culturally based, we had to go back to the cultural that I remember as a kid, where people simply volunteered to help other people out. And this was a way that tribal members who do in Grand Ronde receive quite a bit could give back and help families without being paid. And I felt like it would mean a lot more to the families that were appearing before them if they knew that these people were there on their own time and were not being paid to do it. So being volunteers was a big qualification for me. They have to be tribal members. This was specifically designed to solicit tribal member involvement in the court process, so that was important to me. They needed to be 21 years of age or older. They preferably need to be living within the local area, and that was largely a budgetary situation for me because I did want to at some point be able to compensate them for mileage to have to drive here. So in order to get council's buy-in, I needed to be able to say this would have a very minimal budget impact because I started these programs without any assistance and without any increase in budget. So initially, I needed to be able to cut down costs as best I could. They have to have knowledge, background, or experience in one or more of the following: parenting or foster care, tribal customs and traditions, juvenile law, health care, mental health care, social work, or education. And this was primarily just to cut down on the amount of training work we would have to do so that we could actually get to the meat of the training in the 30 hours. They're also required to go through ongoing training every year. And I think it's 12 hours that they have to complete each year so that they kind of stay current on. And that could be an opioid training. That could be a training on IEPs. There's a variety of trainings that can qualify for their continuing education credits. They also must go through a background and reference check. So we wanted to make sure that we had the right people that council was looking for to serve on this board. Backgrounds and reference checks were important for council. The process in terms of how people become tribal member review board members, they file their applications. We then do their background checks. We do an interview with them so that they're clear on what it is they're applying for. We submit all their information to tribal council. Tribal council at a council meeting approves them to serve on a slate of tribal members. We then coordinate their training, which includes a mock TMRB trial where we solicit the help from Children and Family Services to come over, and we have people who role play the parents so that they get the opportunity to do a hearing within that training. We then assign them to a board of at least 3, but no more than 5 members. So we start setting up the board, and then we wait for the court to assign a case. And once a court assigns a case to the board, the board then reviews that case, has that hearing. It's in an informal setting, so it's tables and people just sit around the chairs. There's a little opening statement about what the purpose of the board is and the fact that they will keep everything confidential and so on. And then at the culmination of the hearing, the TMRB hearing, they make recommendations to the court and to Children and Family Services. The recommendations are viewed by everyone, and the court reviews them and then issues an order following that. So again, benefits, as I've stated already, is that tribal member involvement in child welfare. And child welfare, to me, is primarily a family issue. And if it's a family issue, then it should be a tribal issue. And trying to remove some of that adversarial process, as Kimberly was talking about in Alaska. So trying to shy away from that adversarial process, the TMRB can be a great program that addresses that. It's a great way to do that. The benefits are also budget. So if I'm paying a contracted judge to have a hearing, that's costing me X amount of dollars. If he assigns that case to the TMRB, then of course he's not hearing that case, and that is saving the court's budget money because those volunteers are there without being paid. So there is there is a budget positive in having the TMRB. Challenges. As I spoke to earlier, recruitment can be a challenge. It is tribal members within the area. We are rural, although our tribal member population on the reservation is growing, and that's creating a larger pool of people we can recruit. People are often hesitant to get involved in other families' crisis, and so that can be a major drawback to trying to recruit. Because most of the people we have had apply to be on the tribal member review board have been elders, we've often used our elders and went to our elders community meetings and focused our recruitment in that area as well. Training can be a challenge because they are volunteers, so trying to get a training schedule for that many hours. We do the 30 hours of training is not in-person training. I prefer to give some homework assignments, so some of the training hours are them researching, writing, and answering some questions, and then we're coming together and talking. But getting a training schedule and getting everybody trained can be a challenge as well. And then, again, we have this development of infrastructure. So if I'm going to develop a program here, I need policies and procedures about how things operate. The ordinance gives the skeletal background for the program, but really what are the ins and outs of the program and what each person's supposed to be doing within that program. And that requires some policies and procedures, a method of selecting board members to hear particular cases, a method for conflicts, and so on and so forth. So there's some development of infrastructure that has to take place, and that can also be time-consuming and challenging as well. So I think that brings us to our next poll question, which is, do any of you have a tribal member review board or something similar to this process in your courts? So it's looking like an overwhelming majority are saying no. There are a few yeses. So for those of you who are answering yes, is it developed similar to this structure that we've developed? If you could answer that in the chat, that would be great.
And Angie, I don't know if it would be helpful, but I was thinking that it might be worthwhile to talk a little bit about the expectations placed on the TMRB as far as the logistics go for writing the report, submitting the report, or reviewing it, and how the court staff contributes to that process.
Okay. Did you want to speak to that, or would you like me to?
I can talk about it a little bit because although the Tribal Member Review Board makes the recommendations and they have the hearing, they don't actually write the report. They contribute to it and they review it and they approve it, but the court staff works on setting up the review, making sure that the volunteers who are members of the Tribal Member Review Board are available, and making sure that any accommodations that need to be made are made for that family in particular, because as Angie stated, it's not in the courtroom, it's in another room. So making sure if there's DV concerns, if there's the need to separate the parties before they come in, that is something that is taken care of by the court staff. And then getting the materials to the TMRB, making sure they have all the information they need is something else that the court staff does.
Yes, before I was able to have a program specialist, I was trying to do that. And so some of this, as we developed programs, so first the Indigent Defense Program was developed, and then Tribal Member Review Board was developed. And after that, I realized quickly that I needed some support staff to continue to grow these programs and build these programs. And luckily, Tribal Council funded that position. So that is nice to be able to provide all of that support for the volunteers. Okay, so let's Stacy says that they have a family welfare commission. So it sounds very familiar. They have a stipend. So sometimes they're called upon to testify. Our tribal member review board members are not called to testify at all. They don't come into the court proceeding. So if there's a clarification needed, then the request comes back to the tribal member review board. They clarify their recommendations, and then they send it back to the court. But there's not a court appearance by the tribal member review board. But that's interesting, and I like how they're participating in deciding about the transfer of cases. The transfer of cases here in Grand Ronde is an assessment done by our child welfare program. But again, I think that that would be a great opportunity, as you're doing, to allow tribal members to be involved in that as well, that process about whether cases get transferred. So that is a very good model. I like that. For those of you who don't have tribal member review board programs, does anybody see that there's some value in this? Like, would you see that this could happen within the court you're working in or within the environment you're working in? Have someone typing. I apologize for this not being a poll question. I'm a much more in-person trainer, so I'm used to being able to ask questions of the audience when I'm talking, but I appreciate your patience with me. So
Angie, how long do the volunteers usually stay on the TMRB?
a long time. I have found that and you'll see a short video in a little bit here where you're going to hear from some of our TMRB members as well as our CASAs. And they usually are on for several years. I have some members who've been on probably since the beginning of the program. So 7 years or more. So that's, I think that that's great because they have some longevity and they can bring that stability. And they seem to really like doing it. I think it is a great way for tribal members to volunteer to help out children and families without having to become a foster parent, because some of them are not, able to do that. But this is a way that they feel like they can help kids in foster care and families who are struggling. Kimberly had a question about whether the TMRB interacts with state court cases involving members. No, they do not. I do not know whether we may have tribal members who sit on the state CRB board for Oregon, but our tribal member review board members specifically serve our court here. That was a great question, though. And every question is always an opportunity for expansion. So could it expand to that point where our TMRB members reviewed cases of Grand Ronde children in state care? I'm always looking for ways to serve our members in both state and tribal court. So I think that that's always something that you should have on the radar, and that I appreciate that question because it puts it on my radar.
And at least when I was there at Grand Ronde, the TMRB participated in the state CRB conferences, and the state CRB was always invited the TMRB to be included in that annual conference.
Yes, they did, and to participate in trainings and so on. Is this board similar to ICWA committee? I am not familiar with what the committee is. I guess I can't answer that directly. So the next program that we developed to, again, bring in that community or tribal involvement into our process is the Court-Appointed Special Advocates program. And this program was, I mean, I can give you the history. This is where this one was born. So we had a youth who was in tribal court. He had had very limited involvement. His case was transferred from another state to tribal court. He had had limited contact with the tribal government, or the tribal people in general. And all of a sudden, the case was moved here. He was in this court for, I would say, probably 5 years or more. And it was the only contact he was having, really, with the tribe was through the Child Welfare Services. He turned 18. The court terminated wardship. And at his hearing, he stormed out of the courtroom at the end and was like, "I'm so glad to be done. I never want anything to do with this tribe again." And for me, it was heartbreaking because I knew how much work the tribe, the Child Welfare Services, had put into this child and his family. And that was heart-wrenching for me to hear him say he didn't want anything to do with the tribe anymore. So when the opportunity came about to have a court-appointed special advocates program, I saw this as an opportunity for someone to be appointed to advocate for this child, but to advocate for his cultural connection primarily to the court. So I thought, this kid has only had contact with Child Welfare Services, who oftentimes serves as the parent, who restricts visits with his parent, his bio parents, basically tells him what to do, when to do it, and how he can do it, and has been running his life for 5 years. Whereas the CASA could serve as more of a, in my mind, an auntie or uncle who serves to not only speak for him in court and what they believe is in his best interest, but to advocate for his cultural involvement outside of the child welfare system. So when I started researching CASA, I thought this might be a great fit. I went to Tribal Council, and of course their first response to me was, well, we already pay for attorneys for children. Now you want us to do advocates for children? Like, what's the difference? And so I explained the difference. I explained what happened with this child and how I saw this as somebody who's not looking at their legal interests per se, but more really looking at how well they're connected to the tribe. So they said, okay, if you're willing to do this with no money, which I was, then go ahead and start the program. So we established the program in 2008, and our purpose is to promote and advocate for the best interests of tribal children involved in abuse and neglected cases, again, because that's the primary caseload we have here in Grand Ronde. And by protecting our children, we're protecting our health, welfare, language, customs, traditions of the tribe for this and all future generations. These are volunteer advocates. They are, again, only dependency proceedings. And I will say that in Grand Ronde, we don't have any criminal jurisdictions. We don't have any delinquency for kids. What I would like to do at some point is expand our CASA program to advocate for kids in divorce proceedings as well. But we're not there yet. So it's just a dependency proceeding appointment for volunteers to do that. We first started by getting involved in National CASA, the national organization. And they had a lot of great information for tribal courts wanting to start this project. It started in 1977, for those of you who aren't familiar with National CASA, and they have more than 949 state organizations and local programs across the country serving over 250,000 kids. Amazing feat for volunteers to do this work. And National CASA actually started a tribal court project in 1994 with the goal of bringing CASA to Indian country, essentially. And as of to date, they've done a lot of program changes since we started with National CASA in 2008. But their current model is they have a board that oversees the nonprofit. They have a national leadership council, and then they have 5 councils that serve underneath that. And one of those is specifically a tribal leadership council. So there's the tribal leadership council, the urban Leadership Council, the Suburban Leadership Council, the State Leadership Council, and the Rural Leadership Council. So I sit on the tribal one with the other tribal programs that have CASA programs and are affiliated with National CASA around the country. And we talk about issues and things that are related to court-appointed advocates for kids. There's not a lot of CASA programs that are affiliated. There might be other advocate programs out there, and I'm going to get to that question, but that are affiliated with National CASA at this point. But I will say that historically they have been a great resource of materials, training documents, and just providing steps on how to start the program. At the time I started, there was a manual that sort of helped you walk through that. I think now I've served as a resource for some of these programs to help them get their programs started. But it is a great program, and National CASA is, really good at supporting tribal CASA programs. So I wanted to segue into, and I think this is where Jessica is going to take over. And I wanted to show you, before I finish talking about CASAs, I wanted to show you a video that we did here in our tribal court that you'll get to hear about our Grand Ronde Tribal CASA and our TMRBs. I felt like it might be beneficial for you to hear from some of them and also to hear from the judge. So we use this not only for recruitment for volunteers, but also to share with other tribes who are considering starting these programs, and so that you can see the impact it's had from the court and from these volunteers who are doing the work.
All right, I think I have the video ready to go. I did put the link to this video also into chat. The video should play right on your screen. You should see it here in the black square. And the audio is going to come from wherever you currently have audio to hear from. So you don't need to do anything to adjust. You just need to sit back and enjoy the video.
And we're going to watch a portion of it. The whole video is not available on our website that Jessica has put on there.
Was a lawyer for 30 years. Part of that practice options in the course of that.
Seems like it's cutting out, Jessica.
Is there a problem with the audio? We're not having it?
Yeah, I'm not hearing it. I don't know if anybody else is.
Okay, let's try one more time. I checked this earlier, but sometimes this stuff gets a little bit fickle. All right, we're going to try again.
Oh, I think we don't have sound.
Right, it seems like it's not working out.
Okay, that's okay. No worries. You do have the link there, so for those of you on the phone who would like to listen, there are a few of our CASA volunteers and our Tribal Member Review Board on there talking about their experience, as well as our judge and how he views those programs. So it may be great to share with your council members or others who might be considering some of these programs. So I'm going to go back, though, and we're going to finish talking a little bit more about CASA. Our Court-Appointed Advocate program. So this one's a little bit different because this was my focus on bringing in community versus just tribal members. So again, the advocates have to be volunteers, but they don't necessarily have to be tribal members. They can be members of the community. They have to be 21 years of age or older. They complete 40 hours of training. And I will say that 30 hours of those is a curriculum developed by National CASA that's provided. So that is very handy because it just walks you through how to train volunteers. The last 10 hours are tribal-specific training that we conduct here on the reservation. They get some cultural presentations. They get some background and history on Grand Ronde. And they are able to have a more full picture of what we do here and, again, who we are as people in Grand Ronde. They have to complete the background and reference checks. And national CASA requires that they can't have felonies of any kind in order to be approved. They have to be preferred to have knowledge or experience in child advocacy and tribal customs, but not always. We conduct interviews with them to sort of glean their experience and their desire to be involved. And I didn't know, Adrea, if you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the recruitment that you did. This was one area where you had a lot of success getting CASAs, and you visited multiple areas to do so. So I didn't know if you wanted to touch on that a little bit.
Sure. So one of the major, I guess, events that I attended was Grand Ronde's powwow to recruit volunteers, but I also attended the Polk County State Fair to recruit as well. But probably the biggest recruitment effort was done with some of the nearby counties. So working with the CASA programs, I think is it Benton County that had already established CASA for every child, and they had a lot of CASA volunteers that were had already gone through the national training and then just needed to go through the tribal training for Grand Ronde. They were CASA volunteers that already were assigned cases in state court, so they had some experience already, and they brought some really great energy. They still needed to be educated in tribal law, and they still, needed to be educated in tribal history, and understand that it was a completely different program. But it was a good way to work with the local county programs, and still be able to, and at the same time provide CASAs for tribal member children.
I wanted to answer a question real quickly that Kim had. Does National CASA still offer funding to tribes? At the time that we started ours, they did. We did not request that funding. Tribal Council just had me absorb it within the tribal court budget. They currently offer grants to programs, but they're not tribal specific. So you're eligible as a tribal program to apply for grants, just as all other programs in the country are eligible for those funds. And National CASA's focus has shifted over the last couple of years to a more state, or they basically, as a national organization, want to be dealing with the state organizations, and the state organizations will then work with all the local programs within that state. So if you're interested in a tribal program, the first thing to do would be to talk to the state organization within your state and talk to them about becoming part of the growth plan for that state. But you're also welcome to give me a call, and I'm happy to kind of help make connections, talk about our experience, so on, and share anything. And that goes for all of these programs. I'm more than willing to share forms, policies, all those things that we've done over the years. So some of the benefits to our CASA program is we're fostering that cultural connection. So what I really like to see is I would love CASAs to be putting in their reports, asking who's taking kids to cultural events, who recommending that kids attend cultural events or get involved in cultural activities. So oftentimes the CASAs will find out that the kids are interested in taking culture classes, and they're able to then make those recommendations that those kids are actually enrolled, or that the tribe is, CFS is finding ways to fund and transport kids to those culture classes. So as that is their main focus, that would be, something that's always on the forefront for them, is the cultural connection. It has also been a budgetary benefit. They are volunteers. They are out there. They are assisting and talking to kids, visiting kids, laying eyes on kids. I would like to think that our caseworkers see them as a benefit and a support for them as well. They are not there to just fight with our CFS program. They are there to help them. they provide more eyes on the case. The judge likes different perspectives about what's going on in a case, and they have more eyes on the case. They're required to see the kids more often than caseworkers probably do, so the judge can get some good insight on their daily living from the CASA reports that are filed. And the benefit is we have support from our tribal programs and our national CASA organization. So we've been able to foster those relationships and those connections, and that's always good when we're trying to build connections and collaborate and share resources. Some of our challenges, the training, it's a lot of training. And again, we try to do a model where there's an independent study. So we're sending home assignments so that's not 40 hours of in-person. We try to be very mindful of volunteer time so that when we do bring them on site for something, that it's a training that's very specific to them and that we don't waste their time. The development of the infrastructure, again, starting up new programs, this is always a challenge. We have, policies and procedures need to be written. Conflict of interest forms have to be filled out. And then once CASAs are assigned a case, they need forms that give them questions. So what am I supposed to be asking? What am I supposed to be finding out? And then who sends the letters out to the school? So we have staff members that do all that says this is a CASA, and this CASA may show up at the school, and they are supposed to have access to grade reports, et cetera, et cetera. So that's always a challenge again. And then recruitment. Whenever you're trying to do volunteers, recruitment can be a challenge. Adrea had a lot of success in that. I feel like she was great in recruitment, and we built a good base. CASAs generally only stay around for a couple of years, so the turnover is usually by case. So once a case is gone, most CASAs will move on to another volunteer opportunity in the community. So trying to have a constant flow of volunteers is often hard to do. I just want to take a second. Oh, okay, just giving you contact information. Okay, I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anybody's question. I think what it was key for us, and Adrea launched this campaign, was that we had the support from our tribal council for this program in terms of recruitment. So we launched a campaign. Adrea primarily did all this work, in that we took council members, this just happened to be my dad as well, and we put them on these posters and we advertised in the newspaper. And at the bottom of the ad, you would see information that says, if you want to be a CASA for an Indian Child Contract, the Tribal Court Program Specialist. But these were council members. They were engaged in this I Am for the Child campaign, and I think it was very successful in showing the membership that council was behind this program. This was Councilwoman Kennedy, and then we also had council member Jack Giffen Jr. So all of our council, these are only 3, but all of our council participated in this. They were able to pick a word that they wanted to display, and these ads ran for a year in the smoke signals. Just a great example of how to get your council involved in some of these programs.
I think it's also a good example of how to make the CASA program really tribal specific, and to have that seen by the tribal community and the surrounding community, because I know that the Grand Ronde paper goes out to, people can sign up who aren't tribal members to receive the paper. And we did get a lot of responses through this campaign from people who are interested in being volunteers. Because of the distance, like with the Indigent Defense Program, sometimes that wasn't possible to have them, in Portland or further out and still be a volunteer. But we did make it work for some individuals who were able to be flexible with their time to come down for some of the training, but still were in Portland or were in Corvallis, and then we were able to match them up with a child who was in that area as well.
So I'm going to switch to our next program, And this is yet another program where I was trying to develop a non-adversarial way to resolve disputes within the community. So as the tribe grew, and I live in this community as well, we purchased land, we built housing units, and we now have a larger population of tribal members living on tribal land. Sometimes along with that, these housing situations, there's conflicts and disputes, not to mention other disputes that arise from other things. But I saw the need to develop a non-adversarial process so that tribal members could attempt to resolve conflicts aside from general council meetings, tribal meetings, or going to the court. So we developed the Tribal Peacemaker Program. And essentially it is what I said, it's a non-adversarial way. The peacemaking conferences are intended to reflect the tribe's traditions. So we've been able to customize these peacemaking sessions and conferences to a way that people are comfortable with, so they're not strictly just everybody sitting down at a table. They could be a talking circle. They could be located at alternate locations. So we wanted to have some flexibility in how this was working. The Tribal Council codified this program in the Tribal Court Ordinance, and we established the program in 2008. So the tribal code revisions took place then, and we began recruiting volunteers. For this particular program, the volunteers have to be tribal members, and they have to be tribal members who are respected members of the community. Tribal Council said they had to volunteer again. They have to be tribal. They have to be 25 years of age or older, and they have no felonies or misdemeanor convictions involving moral turpitude or violence within the last 3 years. So council set these qualifications out in the code itself. In terms of the process, it's again an application and a background check. Once we have everything and the judge has reviewed it, then we send it on to Tribal Council for approval at a Tribal Council meeting. Then we begin our training with the peacemakers. This one is a little more difficult if we're trying to utilize cultural methods of dispute resolution. We wanted to start them out with a base of cultural training, so we sent them to Portland, where there was some trainings for cross-cultural mediation. And so they participated in that week-long training, and then they were able to come back and at least have a framework for how they could conduct peacemaking conferences. I didn't want them to be locked in to one and only one way, so we wanted to just give them that framework. So that was a week-long training that they participated in. And then this is a complete voluntary process. So both parties have to come in and want to participate in a peacemaking conference. And if they file that request to do so, then we appoint a peacemaker to conduct the conference, and the peacemaker then sets up the time and the location and all that with the parties. The benefits to this program, again, I'm a big believer in tribal member involvement in court process. It also resolves disputes without judicial intervention, and that, of course, has a positive impact on my overall court budget. The challenges have been underutilization of the program, and that I would love to believe that we don't have conflicts here in Grand Ronde. I live here, though, and however, I know that is not the case. So we're still having challenges with getting people to come in and request the program for disputes. We want to make this a voluntary process, so it's not a mandated peacemaking process. I'm not sure we want to get there. If Tribal Council decides that they want to do that, that may change the landscape of this program, in that if they order people with housing disputes to first participate in the Peacemaker program, that will change the context of it. But as of yet, it's completely voluntary. So oftentimes we'll have one party come in and want to resolve a dispute, maybe about a barking dog or something to that effect, because they're neighbors, but the other party doesn't want to come. So there are some challenges with that. We're constantly trying to sell the program and constantly trying to get people to utilize it. But there's also the context and the culture that court is an adversarial process. And so for us, we have to flip that on its head, and sometimes that's hard for the community to grasp, is that the court might have this program that's not adversarial and that there isn't a winner and loser, that there's a middle ground. So it's taken some work on our part for that. The training is always a challenge because the tribal members have to travel to Portland for that training. And so that can be time-consuming and difficult for them to schedule because, again, they're volunteers. The development of the infrastructure, again, what is the process? How do you handle them? What's the time frames? We try to set time frames so people aren't lagging around waiting. They file a request, and we say within X amount of days we want that request to be dealt with. We don't want it sitting around for a long time. So that involves policies and procedures about how the program operates and runs. I assume this might receive some more yes responses. Do you have peacemaking programs? One of your poll questions.
And if some of you are answering the questions, if you could answer in the chat too about whether the Peacemaker program is something that is ordered to happen by the judge, if it's something that's voluntary, and maybe like whether it happens regularly or, like Angie said, it's really dependent on the participation and the willingness of both parties to be willing to go through the process. Angie, could you talk a little bit about things that maybe you've done to try to increase participation in the Peacemaker program?
So I just take a shot in the dark and say that I think a lot of the conflicts that I think we could be most helpful with are housing disputes. So we've taken some steps to participate in housing tenant meetings and spread the news about the possibility of this project. I really was excited because we had one of our peacemakers who the school was interested in trying to use this Peacemaker program to help parents and kids in our local school district resolve disputes. So I was very excited. We had a peacemaker who's in the community who was very willing to do that. And then in September, before the school year started, he was elected to tribal council. So he's no longer able, he doesn't have the time to do it anymore. But that is another inroad that we thought would be an area where there are conflicts oftentimes, and that the peacemaker could really lend their services to help resolve some of those conflicts. So those are some of the things we've done to try to target areas where we see conflict and we think that people might find some resolution by coming here. We've also been able to use it a little bit in some of the court cases we've had. So we had a couple of parents who, one of which wanted to change the child's name, and the other parent was objecting, but rather than just battle it out in court, they opted to go talk to a peacemaker and see if they could come up with some middle ground. So we've been able to utilize it for that as well.
Well, and I think that the benefit of having the peacemakers attend the cross-cultural or community mediation, and also like with working with the CASA program and working with nearby counties or other programs and seeing the kinds of trainings that are provided there, and bringing, in some instances, bringing those trainings into the community are also great ways to benefit the community as a whole. And so if there there are people trained as peacemakers and they decide to apply to be on the TMRB or something like that, that's still that benefit that they bring, bring to the court.
Yes, definitely. Kimberly had a question about their peacemaker programs in the planning stage. And she says, is there a reason the council provides oversight? So the council established the peacemaker program via ordinance, but the court we provide the oversight. So the program specialist position is the one that orchestrates, recruits the volunteers, assigns the peacemaker to the session, sets things up, does all that work, and helps type up the agreement. So it is a court function. The council just simply said, we want this program. And this was one where I assumed, just hearing and working in Indian country off and on, that I assumed that this would be more 50-50, which is kind of what the poll looked like, that there are some programs out there. So if there are some different models, I always encourage everybody to share lots of information, because I assume that there are other peacemaker programs out there. And so I'm hoping that you're seeing the benefit to those, and that you're, willing to start one of these up in your community if you're not. Oh, it's even, yeah. So, and Gerald says that it's a lot like mediation. Some of ours have been a lot like mediation because that's what the parties are more familiar with, and it's been more of a mediation, whereas others we've used, a talking stick and a circle. They've been more cultural. They've invited other family members to participate, not just the parties to the action. So I think there are all different models of peacemaking. Peace-giving is also another phrase that's kind of interchangeable with that. So I appreciate you sharing those comments and that information. I'm going to move into our final program, so we make sure we have a few minutes left for any last-minute questions. The most current program that we've developed here in the tribal court is the Tribal Court Bar Program, and this was not a program that I was intending to bring tribal membership. This one is I shifted gears. This one wasn't to encourage tribal member involvement in the court, but more to flex our muscle as our own court and our own sovereign. And this was born for me and from tribal council as well, as a way that we don't want to have to run to our state bar organization to file reports to punish attorneys for misconduct in our court. So it was very much a sovereignty issue for me, very much we should be able to investigate, process complaints and concerns about attorneys that are appearing in our court, and we shouldn't have to turn that over to anybody else to do that. So we started the state bar, or our tribal bar program, in 2013. The idea is obviously to protect our litigants and ensure the quality of justice within our system. The tribal council codified the program in the tribal court ordinance. And obviously, to start the program, we had to get the code revisions. And behind that, you had to talk to tribal council and get their support for it as well. As with some of the other things we've done here in the court, though, we don't want to make it difficult for tribal members to get attorneys that are willing to practice in tribal court. So what we did to start with was we said that the American Bar Association model rules of professional conduct apply. That way, attorneys aren't scared that there's a whole new set of professional conduct rules that they needed to learn to be able to be members of our tribal court bar and practice in our tribal court. We had to establish a bar commission, so we have a method of reviewing bar complaints. Qualifications for bar membership, we also didn't want to make this too onerous on anybody, because we want to encourage people to participate in the tribal court and not discourage that. So they have to be attorneys licensed to practice law in one or more of the 50 states. They have to be in good standing in all jurisdictions to which they're admitted. no felonies or misdemeanors involving moral turpitude, and they have to pay an initial application fee as well as a yearly bar membership fee. We kept those very minimal. It's like $25 a year, $75 application fee, just because it takes time for us to process those and issue the orders approving them and making them bar members. The benefit for me is our ability to regulate our own attorney conduct. Thankfully, we have never had a complaint rendered against an attorney that we've had to deal with, so that says something about the quality of attorneys that appear before us. But the challenges for me, again, that development of infrastructure. For every program that I have, every great idea I have, there's hours worth of sitting down and writing policies and procedures, creating applications, creating a process for checking backgrounds, working with our human resource department, working with our gaming, developing a system so we could check all the bar memberships to make sure they were in good standing. So there's always that, like I said, every great idea I have to start a program, there's hours worth of infrastructure that has to be put into place, which, again, I'm willing to share some of that work that we've done on that. But that has been the major challenge for that. We haven't received many other complaints about our process. Everybody's really glad they don't have to take a bar exam. We do hear that. So with that, that kind of wraps up at least me talking about what our programs are here. I think that if I have sort of a final word of advice, these programs that we've developed here are a reflection of what's needed in our community. And I think whenever you're looking at your court or working in a court or working on a team that's doing capacity building for a tribal court, you have to be mindful of what's needed in your community. So having lived here, having worked in child welfare, having been the court administrator for a little while, these programs were ones that I saw were needed. I think that they might not be needed in every community and in every tribe, but I think that always has to be the starting point, is talking about doing some kind of surveys, taking a snapshot, talking to counsel. What kind of complaints do you hear? Are there things that we could manage in the court for you? That type of thing, having some open communication with your tribal government to understand how could we meet these needs. Some things that we've done outside of programs would be, we had a lot of people saying they needed notaries in the community. So now we are the notary office for the court. We've had people saying they needed a central place to obtain tribal ordinances. That's now our office. So really being responsive to the needs of your community so that your tribal community sees you as a resource and a friend, and not just a place where everyone dreads to go because they have a ticket or something of that nature. So that's my kind of bit of advice, is really to survey your community and to always be willing to add. So we've added these programs and expanded our capacity as we could afford it and as the needs arose. So there's obviously other ways I'd like to expand the court and more programs, but that has to be very thought out to me and a step-by-step process. And, of course, tribal council has to be on board with those as well. So you might see more programs from us in the future. But what we have.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
I just wanted to ask if you could, because having a court administrator like you working through these programs and creating these programs is obviously very important. I know that there's some judges on the webinar too. Can you talk just real briefly about how you bring in the judge when you're either forming these programs or carrying out the trainings and things like that?
Sure. Well, the judge is my boss, so everything runs by the judge and always have. And some of these programs were brainchildren of the judges, as I talked about for the indigent defense particularly. So they're judges seeing a need. They're judges sitting in the courtroom saying, I wish we had a program that would help them with this. It was a different judge that also saw the child that left the courtroom and didn't want to have anything to do with the tribe anymore, that also caused a lot of anxiety for that judge as well. So we brainstorm about what's going on in the courtroom and could we develop a program that would help to address that? So we work very much in partnership. I think that a lot of the behind-the-scenes work is done by myself and the other court staff, just because budget-wise it makes more sense. But ideology, the judge has to be on board with everything, and they have to participate in it. And if you get the chance to watch our video about our court programs, you'll see our chief judge on there talking about how he feels about the programs that we have. And I think that that's great. And then there are some programs maybe that they're a little hesitant about, but they've seen, the benefit of those. But I think you can't do any of this without a judge that's willing to work in partnership with you. They truly are the head of the court, so they have to be involved in all of that. Kimberly had a question about the bar exam, which I said we don't require. How do you know that they possess knowledge of the tribal law? They have to basically say that they're in good standing. They have to basically say that all of our tribal laws are online, so they're able to access those and read those. And other than their statements that they possess the knowledge they need to appear, and it would be malpractice if they appear and they're not educating themselves on the law, then that could be a malpractice issue for them as well, or a bar complaint issue. So we don't have any particular way without the bar exam, but the fact that you're becoming a bar member means you agree to become familiar with those laws, and not only the laws, but the rules of civil procedure, appellate procedure, so on and so forth. Have any other questions that Adrea or myself might be able to answer? But I think Rebekah is trying to get back on the line. So I want to wait and see if she has any closing questions or remarks.
All right, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. Thank you, Angela and Adrea, for that very interesting and informative presentation. I apologize for that pause. Before we conclude, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about NAICJA and our work in tribal communities. For those of you who are new to our webinars, NAICJA is a tribal justice professional organization whose goal is to build and enhance tribal court capacity. We do a pretty broad range of work in tribal communities for tribal communities, including training and technical assistance to support tribal courts. We're also TA providers for the Bureau of Justice Assistance, CTAS Purpose Area 3 grantees. Another part of our work is the Tribal Access to Justice Innovation website. This website allows us to highlight and share different programs in tribal communities. If you know of a promising program, let us know about it. And if it's not already highlighted on that website, we can go ahead and share it. That website is tribaljustice.org. And again, our goal with it is to learn about emerging practices and share that information, as many tribes are addressing common challenges. And with that, I'll conclude our webinar. My email address is rebekah@naija.org, rebekah@naija.org. If anyone has any questions or TA requests, please email me. Otherwise, thank you to our presenters for your presentation, and NCJFCJ again for hosting, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Alrighty, so at the end of our webinar today, hopefully you'll get a brief survey about the webinar that will pop up on your screen, so you can let us know any suggestions you have for future webinars and topics you'd like to see in the future. Thank you everyone for participating.